Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Insights from the Quad series on the legal responses to COVID-19. I'm Monica Hakimi. I'm on the faculty here, and I'm also one of the associate deans. And we started the series because of COVID. We know that many people are stuck in their homes or not able to socialize in ways that they ordinarily do. And so we thought we would do what we at Michigan Law do, I think, pretty well, which is build an online community, or at least a community, and make it online because of the pandemic. And so this is the second of a number of events in this series. I hope you'll join us for the others. The next one, just so you know, is on October 13th at the same time from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And it will be on voting rights and American democracy with Sam Bagenstos and Ellen Katz. So before we get started, I'll just give you two more bits of information. The first is just to let you know that you won't be able to see other attendees on this webinar. You'll only be able to see me and the other panelists. And second, that the webinar is being recorded. So if for any reason you miss something or you need to log off, since you're a registered participant, you'll receive a link to the video after the event and can watch it again, or at least watch it for the first time. So with that, let me begin with my introductions. All three panelists are, of course, members of the Michigan Law faculty. Nicholson Price, maybe Nicholson, you could just wave to, has a PhD in biological sciences and teaches and writes in the areas of intellectual property, health law, and regulation, particularly focusing on the law surrounding innovation in the life sciences. Nick Bagley also focuses on health law, but he comes at it more from an administrative law perspective. And when the pandemic struck, he went to work for Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's office and helped craft our regulatory response to the pandemic. And third, Kyle Logue is the Douglas A. Kahn Collegiate Professor of Law here, and his work centers on the areas of tax, tort, and insurance law. So Nicholson, maybe I could start with you, because the thing that I most want to know, and I think the thing that a lot of other people want to know, is when this pandemic will end. And I think the answer to that seems to depend on when there's a vaccine. So when might that be, and how is progress on it coming along?
So the sad news is that it definitely depends on when there is a vaccine, but it won't be, the pandemic won't end when there's a vaccine. It's still, there's a lot of work on the back end once we have something. When will we have a vaccine? Maybe the end of the year, maybe early next year. One vaccine probably won't cut it. We'll probably end up getting multiple vaccines over the course of the next year or so. I think it's very unlikely that we will get a vaccine by November 2nd, despite pronouncements to that effect. It's actually been really interesting seeing kind of how the government has been trying to make vaccines happen quickly. They've got this huge apparatus, Operation Warp Speed, which we learned yesterday, turns out involves not only a lot of folks from the agencies you'd expect, like the National Institutes of Health and the FDA and the CDC, but also a huge number of military personnel, which is something kind of surprising. This turns out to be more of a turn on all the spigots kind of moment than I think many people had thought. So lots of money pouring into this at the front end. The government's also doing an interesting job scaling up manufacturing capacity even before we know we have a vaccine that works, right? Normally you make a drug, you get it approved, and then you start making it large amounts. That's been happening for months now, scaling up of manufacturing capacity with the idea that once a vaccine is eventually approved, and then others are eventually approved, will be kind of ready to go with lots of doses. So there's been a lot of positive development, I think, on the front end. Things are moving much, much faster, like far, far faster than we might have expected, although still slower than any of us would like.
Okay, great. And so could you tell us a little bit what we might expect once a vaccine actually is developed?
Oh, yes,
on the back end?
Total disaster. Well, sorry, that's probably putting it impolitically. Lots of interesting work on the front end. On the back end, things seem very up in the air. The biggest question is, if we have a vaccine that is approved, will we be able to trust that it is, in fact, a vaccine that works well? And if you'd asked me that question half a decade ago, I would have said, of course, there's no question. but there has been an unprecedented level of kind of political interference and oversight with FDA. The most recent news out today is that FDA had been saying, hey, we're trying to allay trust by putting out a new guidelines about what we are going to need to approve a vaccine, and we're going to be stricter about it. We recognize people are worried about what a vaccine is going to take, what approval really means, and so we're going to set a fairly high threshold for what we need to approve a vaccine. And the news out either last night or this morning was, turns out those guidelines might never actually see the light of day because FDA said we're going to issue them, and Secretary Azar, who's the Secretary of Health and Human Services, said these look good to me. And then they got to the White House and President Trump said, I'm not sure if that's necessary. And then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows said, I'm not sure that those stricter standards are necessary either. So it's unclear not only whether those guidances or that guidance will be followed, but whether anybody will ever know what it said.
And so,
go ahead.
Sorry. So if we're not sure that we can trust what comes out of FDA, what should we make of the statements by industry groups that they are actually going to ensure that their protocols and processes are up to snuff and won't put anything to market unless they're absolutely certain that it's safe and responsive to the virus?
Yeah, this is deeply, deeply weird. For those of you who haven't been following along at home, kind of industry groups and heads of drug companies are saying, we're going to be super safe about this, going on talk shows, talking about how much evidence they're going to need before they submit something to FDA. This is not normally the way these things work, right? Normally the way these things work is, at least we think about it as, drug companies are trying to develop things and then they send things to FDA, and the FDA is the arbiter of what's enough evidence, what's safe enough, what we should rely on. And here we've got drug companies saying, well, it's okay if you don't trust the FDA because we're going to step up and we're going to ensure that there is in fact enough information. So that's a strange turnabout, and I think reflects how far public trust has been shaken. The other big thing on that front, which I found fascinating, is the National Medical Association, which is an organization of Black physicians, has said that they're creating their own task force to independently review evidence on vaccines and therapeutics. A number of states have just come out and said they're also going to independently review evidence on vaccines. The legal term for this, as Professor Bagley has coined it and repeatedly used on Twitter, is it's crazy pants. This is crazy pants that we are seeing these actors that are not the FDA saying, don't worry that you can't trust the world's preeminent authority on drugs about this new crucial world-saving drug. We've got it from here.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, since you invoked Nick, maybe we could come to you, and you could tell us a little bit about governmental regulation until that happens. So, we're all hoping to get a vaccine, but until that happens, we seem to be in the state of persistent uncertainty and on again, off again restrictions, depending on one's locality, one's job, one's pre-existing health conditions, and a variety of other factors. So, it's easy to say, I think, that federal, state, and local officials should make public health informed decisions about when and how to open. But what does that actually mean in practice? Like, what sorts of considerations go into deciding what restrictions are warranted in the public interest?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is complicated. So far, Governor Whitmer, and she's not unusual in this, she's issued 185 executive orders, most of which amend previous orders to combat the COVID pandemic. And these executive orders are issued pursuant to her authority that she's been given to respond to an emergency. And laws like this exist in most states, which is where you get the authority to issue the lockdown orders. And a lot of these orders are things you've heard of, right? The mask mandates, the lockdown orders, but a lot of them aren't, right? They're changes to K through 12 rules so that you can manage the transition to online education, or they are workplace safeguards to make sure that workers aren't infected on the job, or they're changes to hospital liability rules, right? There's like a whole run of things that have to happen. So when you're thinking about what it looks like from the inside of a governor's office, I think there are like 3 lessons that I might want to impart. Like, first, governors' offices are tiny. Like, they're much, much smaller than you imagine. And yeah, you can rely on your public health officials, and you do, and you have a much larger public health agency that you're depending on. But ultimately, the hard decisions get channeled through an extremely small group of people, which includes the lawyers that actually have to be drafting these executive orders. And those people are way overworked, right? They are managing like hundreds of decisions that normally would take weeks, months to hash out. And they're trying to make the judgment calls very, very fast. And they're doing it like painting that like the order that Michigan adopted to shut down its economy, was drafted over basically a weekend. I mean, like it happened like that. And you're trying to, in that first order, distinguish between those kind of businesses that have to stay open versus those businesses that don't. And you're working on that, trying to make that judgment call on the basis of a lack of information about exactly what truly is essential. And you're worried that if you turn out the lights in a particular spot, that's going to have ripple effects in the rest of the economy. So huge uncertainty, a huge amount of stress, a very small number of people with their hair on fire all the time. And they're getting yelled at all the time because none of their decisions make the stakeholders that are on the ground happy. Second, when you say you want to make a public health data informed decision, that sounds really good. And all the governors are saying it. The trouble is like, once you think about it for a minute, all the public health data tell you are kind of where your cases are, where they're likely to go, and where spread is likely to happen. They don't actually tell you how to draw like the tough trade-offs between shutting down restaurants for an extended period of time, which means lots of them are going to go under, right? Now, how do you feel in your state about, basically consigning a bunch of small businesses that people have poured their heart and souls into against the risk that they're going to be sources of transmission? And by the way, doing that against a backdrop of like real uncertainty, at least early in the pandemic, about where transmission was actually happening. But it actually goes way deeper than just that kind of trade-off question. So these orders that you issue from the executive office of the governor, you think that they like go out there and they magically change the world. And to some extent they do, but orders are only as good as they are if they're enforced, right? And a lot of these orders are kind of border between like the difficult and impossible to enforce. And that's so for a bunch of reasons. Like one reason is that local law enforcement often doesn't think its job is to enforce COVID orders. Now that might be a short-sighted vision of what it is to be a local law enforcement official, but nonetheless, and there were even sheriffs here in Michigan who decided that the governor was a tyrant, that her orders were unconstitutional, and that they would not enforce them. And so it got caught up in the politicization of the pandemic, which means that you have to not only think about like what the public health data tell you, but what you can get public buy-in on, which means that the decision about how tightly to squeeze is partly a decision about public health data, but it's also a question about what people will bear. And when enough people say, I'm going to ignore your order, you're actually undermining the governor's orders going forward. And so it's a really tough balancing act. The third thing I'll say is that when you say you want to make a public health informed decision, you got to trade that off not only against other values, but also like deal with the fact that there's a ton of uncertainty here. It would have been really nice if, as Nicholson suggested, like we had a federal government we could trust, if CDC had issued recommendations and guidelines on the lockdowns and the reopenings that seemed to be informed by the best recommendations from the public health experts, but we didn't. The first reopening plan, the major reopening plan that the Trump administration put out in like May, what said, the very first stage that you should open up movie theaters. And you're like, what? Like, where did that come from? And it seemed to be a backdoor way for them to allow for other indoor spaces like churches to reopen, because in many states, not in Michigan, churches have been restricted. But that's not the kind of recommendation you can blindly take on board. Another hard decision we faced was how much liability protection we ought to extend to hospitals and physicians who are trying to respond on the ground. So here in Michigan, we got hit really hard early on. And in March and April, we were looking at standing up effectively a field hospital at a local convention center. ERs were overrun. Doctors were being pulled off of their normal rotations. And the question there was, if we relieve hospitals and physicians of negligence liability, we protect them as the law allowed us to do. On the one hand, we might countenance more sloppy medical care. On the other hand, like there are a lot of very risk-averse hospital administrators out there. We didn't want them worrying about liability when thinking about whether to pull up an OBGYN doc and put her on the COVID ward because they just needed somebody else to take care of people. So to give them the flexibility, we did extend a liability shield that far, but we chose not to extend it to a wide array of other businesses that have asked for it. And indeed, the governor has vetoed bills. So, trying to draw difficult trade-offs about liability and like its effects downstream, one of the questions that consumed us, and you make the best call you can with the information that you have, knowing that you're going to get some of them wrong.
So I want to actually ask Kyle a little bit more about the liability question. But before we move to you, Kyle, Nick, I want to follow up with something you said. It's maybe a mix of your second and third points, which is, there are all these considerations that go into it that sound in the register of like, well, what can the public bear? What is coming? What is happening at the federal level or at other levels of government? And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the extent to which, at least the state of Michigan, because that's what took into account both like the politics around mask wearing and what was happening at the national level, as well as the politics here in Michigan about all of that, as well as the question of like what actually Michiganders were willing to tolerate, and how you thread that needle when some of the things that Michiganders were willing to tolerate, I assume, or were not willing to tolerate, I should say, I assume were things that were very much in the interests of public health.
Yeah. It's a big and complicated question, but I'll just bring your mind back to the initial anti-lockdown rallies were largely held here in Michigan, right? Lansing got a lot of attention and some really pretty ugly photographs out of these early resistance efforts and people bringing guns into the Capitol. It was a tough time. A couple of thoughts on that. The first is one remarkable thing that you saw in the public polling data and still see in the public polling data is that there is like overwhelming majority support for continuing restrictions to prevent the spread of COVID. And so it's easy to see those very televised, those televised interventions and think, everybody is against these orders. If you actually dig into the data, they largely weren't. And that gave us a little bit more room to run. Because like voluntary compliance with these orders is a cornerstone of them, though, we did have to take into account what people were willing to do. Back in April, before masks became ubiquitous, the governor couldn't just say, like, you're all wearing masks tomorrow. That would not have been an order that would have been accepted. But over time, the governor started wearing masks at her press conferences. We endorsed masks as recommendations. We actually did impose an early version of the mask mandate, but it didn't get as much attention as it should. And a lot of people didn't even know it existed. So we reissued the mask mandate. Even though it didn't change very much, it put it on people's radar screens at a time that they were willing and able to accept it. So I think, I want to be clear, right? Like, just because there is kind of politics happening out there, it doesn't mean that you are either a slave to it or that you can just ignore it, right? And I think the governor did a nice job trying to tack between those two extremes, right? You can only push people as far as they're willing to be pushed, but a lot of people are willing to be pushed pretty far when they see a need. And I think she stuck to her guns when a lot of other governors were afraid about possible blowback. And I think she did so for about as long as she could manage. Doesn't mean every decision she got was right or that she struck the balance correctly at every stage. Lord knows she didn't. These are hard calls, but I think she did a decent job. I will also just close by saying that this job was made about 1 billion times harder because President Trump has been so reluctant to endorse basic recommendations of his public health officials. If we could have been on the same page about the masks earlier, we could have gotten to yes on masks and across the broader population much faster. You would have been pushing on an open door as opposed to pushing on a closed door. And I think that people may underestimate the extent to which, the resistance to these lockdown orders, the people who are flouting mask mandates are really looking to leadership in Washington. And that means President Trump. And I think he has to own a lot of this personally. Because I think he's done a lot of damage to the cause of suppressing COVID spread.
Okay, Kyle, let's talk about liability. So while all of this is happening on the public side, I'm sure the private sector is concerned about ways in which it might be held liable for conduct relating to COVID. So I guess the question, just the starting question, is how should we think about the risk that certain institutions, whether institutions like the MBA or educational institutions, might be held liable for opening too soon or too quickly? And to what extent can that risk of liability be mitigated through some kind of public or private insurance mechanism?
Well, there's definitely a risk, right? Whether it's because they open too soon or fail to take certain steps in the process of opening, there's always a potential for tort risk here. But I think it's significantly less than, at least over the medium and long term, than many people believe, especially the people who are pushing for sort of permanent statutory protection for various institutions from COVID-related liability. And so why do I think it's less than many people think? First of all, there's some evidence that it's not as big as you might think. There's a bunch of COVID trackers out there who are keeping, like it's a small industry now, keeping track of COVID-related litigation. And there are lots of suits. There are over 5,000, according to one of these trackers, there's over 5,000 sort of civil cases filed with respect to COVID. And of those, only like 70 or 80 are tort suits, wrongful death claims, personal injury claims. So if we're expecting a flood, we haven't gotten a flood yet. The other reason to expect that it's not going to be a flood or like the opening of the floodgates is just tort law itself. These would be negligence claims. Again, not brought by employees against their employer. That's a separate question, which I can talk about if you want. That is governed by workers' comp. But if it's someone other than an employee bringing a claim, they've got to demonstrate that the defendant institution failed to take reasonable care, right? So on that, the cheapest form of insurance is to take reasonable care, right? Now, the problem is what exactly is reasonable care, given how new this is, and the institutions do complain with some justification that they're not getting any guidance from the federal government, and the guidance they get from the states varies about what constitutes reasonable care, and they're not told that complying with these rules will totally excuse them. So I understand that, but still, if an institution tries to do basically what their governor tells them to do, and to the extent possible, consistently with what the CDC says, they're going to be in pretty good shape. But the bigger reason it's unlikely to be a flood is the other element of a tort claim, which is causation. And this is what everybody's mentioning. I'm not the first to notice this, but the difficulty will be to prove, even if you can show that an institution failed to take reasonable care, that particular breach of their responsibility was the cause of your COVID. And that's going to be hard. And yes, you can buy liability insurance also. Like that. I mean, I guess I would say this: not only can you go out and buy it, but in some ways, the more important question is go back and look at the policies that you had during the relevant phase, which starts at the very beginning and goes all the way up until now, and see whether your policies have coverage. Right? It's not that can you buy it. You can buy almost anything, but did you buy it? Do you have it? And so you should read your policy. Lots of people don't read their insurance policies. I don't understand why that's the case, but if you read all of it, including the endorsements at the end. And so, for example, you might a company's commercial general liability insurance policy, which covers them for slip and fall accidents, may well cover them for this because this is a potential bodily injury claim. The thing I'd tell you to look for, though, is at least since 2006, following the SARS scare and the SARS episode, was followed by the Insurance Services Office, which is the organization that helps draft insurance policies. Came up with an exclusion in 2006 for cases arising out of pathogens, including viruses. So if you have that, you may not have coverage. But the kind of I mean, I agree with Nick that in the moment, like during the emergency, when we need people to do things, like what you need certain actors who are in the room talking to you to go out and do things, like rededicate doctors to different purposes, or to make masks, or to make vaccines. Sometimes you have to sort of make trade-offs with what we expect tort law to do. So tort law is out there in part as a kind of regulatory mechanism, But especially under conditions of uncertainty that prevail during a pandemic, with people being risk averse, the trade-off that you have to make is difficult. But sometimes you have to sort of lower the standards a little bit in order to induce people to act. The big question that's coming around now is, do you make those permanent?
Right.
Are we now in a stage where we have to induce institutions to come forward and act? Will institutions continue to engage in business? Will they bring students in without this liability protection? We've got a fair amount of evidence that they're not so deterred from doing it that they're not willing to go forward. And we do need tort liability as a kind of incentive. I'm sure that at least to some extent, when corporate actors and academic decision makers are deciding about, what standards of care to adopt, in the back of their mind, they're thinking, it's not their first priority, but one of the things they're considering is whether or not they're going to be able to, minimize their risk of liability. And that's one of the good things of tort liability.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be not in favor of sort of a blanket immunity. I think we've got enough of the executive orders that we've had and the federal statutes that have been enacted to protect sort of narrow cases like vaccines and countermeasures are probably enough.
Mm-hmm. And great. And since you mentioned workplace comp, one of our questions that came in before this was about employers being held liable for getting their employees sick. And so could you talk a little bit about the likelihood of claims being successful under a workplace comp scheme?
Yeah. So workers' comp statutes were enacted in the early part of the 20th century as a part of what's sometimes called the Great Compromise, where they basically barred common law tort claims and replaced them with workers' comp insurance regime. Mm-hmm. And the difference is you don't have to prove, if you're a victim, you don't have to prove negligence on the part of the employer. You just have to demonstrate that your injury, or in some states your occupational illness, arose out of your within the scope of your employment and out of working at your job, right? So you have to demonstrate causation and a causal connection with your job. Mm-hmm. So that's what they would have now, right? Like in all 50 states, to get recovery, you're going to have to demonstrate that your COVID was caused by your work, right? And that won't be easy necessarily, right? That for reasons that I've already described, like you could get it from lots of different places. How can you prove that you got it from your work? Interestingly, there's been a push in the opposite direction. If there's been a push towards protection from liability in the tort domain, in the workers' comp domain, I failed to mention a bunch of 12 states have enacted essentially protections for institutions from corporations and other institutions from tort liability for COVID. But about a third of the states have made it easier to bring workers' comp claims, at least for certain classes of individuals. And those tend to be like first responders. But in cases like that, a bunch of states have either by statute or I think in Michigan's case, there's an order that creates a presumption that if you are a first responder or a COVID responder, then your COVID was, and you can track COVID, it was caused as a result of a workplace activity. So they've sort of tried to make it easier, but not every state's done that. In the states that haven't done it, so 2/3 of the states, it'll be a challenge.
And then I think you said there were something like 5,000 cases pending by one count, right? So to what extent should we expect the courts to get involved in making decisions at a very minute level, or to what extent do you think like actually it's going to be so hard to prove causation, for example, for a general tort claim, that the courts probably don't have that much to do, and just a couple cases will basically resolve the causation is really hard to establish, and then that'll sort of be the end of this line of litigation?
So again, the tort cases are a small minority of the cases, and they're not going well so far for the plaintiffs. There are a couple of sort of well-known federal cases in California, which were brought by people who contracted, allegedly, COVID on cruise ships. And they lost on 12b6 motion to dismiss, because apparently they couldn't even make a plausible argument that there was causation. So it's likely that they're not going to do well on the tort side, although I could be surprised. A much bigger proportion of those claims are like insurance claims, right? And so probably I would say that you might call it the new asbestos litigation in the insurance context is going to be or is becoming quickly whether or not a business's property insurance coverage for business interruption includes coverage for COVID-related losses during the shutdown. And there have been some class actions filed. There's some litigation going on right now about whether or not they should consolidate these into a multi-district litigation. And that's going to be going on. Insurance lawyers busy for years, maybe decades. And I think the courts will have a lot to say about that. I think that's going to be resolved by courts ultimately. The one thing I'll mention, and then I'll stop, is this business interruption thing has gotten so much press and it's so much attention because people feel like, their restaurants closed down. Shouldn't they be able to get their business interruption coverage? It sounds like the thing that would cover it, but their insurers are denying coverage. So in a number of states, the state legislatures have not passed these laws yet, but they have proposed laws that would make the insurance companies retroactively liable for business interruption coverage back to the January 1st of 2020, or at least to the beginning of it. And that is very interesting because that would raise constitutional questions of takings and maybe contract clause violations and could have a significant effect on the insurance industry.
Super interesting. Well, I feel like it would be abdicating my responsibility as moderator if the question of the role of the courts came up and I did not ask Nick Bagley to respond because I know he has very strong views about the role of the courts in highly regulated industries. So Nick, do you want to opine or respond?
I would love to opine. In my view, and take this with a grain of salt that my prior role should lead you to take it with, courts have been nothing but problems when it comes to COVID. The general approach has been for a disgruntled group, whether a gym or group of gyms or bars or whatever else, to file a lawsuit challenging governors' shutdown orders or lockdown orders on this ground or that. You've seen these cases being brought by churches, you've seen these cases being brought by wedding event planners, and pretty much every governor has had to combat a clutch of cases. And these cases, one of the striking things is how whether you win or lose depends almost entirely on the partisan affiliation of the judge of the governor or president who appointed the judge, or the partisan affiliation that the judge ran on in the cases where the judges are elected. So here in the state of Michigan, we lost on rational basis review a case about whether gyms ought to be closed. On rational basis review, which gives you a sense of just how aggressive conservative courts became as soon as this issue became politicized. Right now, pending at the Michigan Supreme Court, are two cases challenging the governor's authority to proceed by executive order at all. In other words, if the two challenges that are up in the docket right now succeed, the governor's emergency powers to respond to a second wave could be terminated. She could effectively be hamstrung in her ability to do anything going forward. There would still be some residual authority in the director of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, but the range of interventions that he can make may be smaller than the range of interventions that the governor can make. And the answer, the question that I have with all of this is, for what? What are we getting out of all this? There's a claim, a thread that you hear, and you hear this from public health folk too, and I find it really troubling that what we're doing is we're protecting people's rights, we're protecting people's liberties. That's what we're doing. It's standing up for people's liberties against these tyrants. And I just think what? How far gone do you have to be to think that that's what's actually in the offing? The governors here are not closing stores down because they like doing it, and they're not doing it cavalierly or without any kind of regard for people's lives. Quite to the contrary, they're trying to protect lives. And the notion that we need the courts coming in to second guess the governor's orders and to say, well, the legislature should really be in charge of this response, which would be a calamity given the difficulty that legislatures have in actually doing anything at speed, I find really galling. And I think it should force a reevaluation for those of us who, are apt to use the language of judicial supremacy, the notion that courts are out there to protect liberties and, fight for the little guy, to say, hey, maybe actually courts are just good at saying no when they disagree with the political party that's making the decisions. And maybe judicial review has a little bit more to do with that than it does with the standing up for the little guy. That the story of Brown looms too large in our minds, and the story of, our loss in the rational basis case should loom a little bit more heavily. But I will now pause with my rant.
Nicholson, please.
So I'm just curious as to, so I hear you talking about preservation of liberty, and we shouldn't worry about that. We shouldn't worry about authoritarianism and any of these things. I'm just curious as to how much this is inflected by the fact that you worked for the governor of Michigan and think that she's a smart, reasonable person and did good things. So for instance, if, say, the Trump administration were to issue an executive order saying nobody can wear masks anymore, and also the vaccine that's farthest in the trial, it is now approved, and that's the vaccine that everybody's going to get if they want it, and they don't have to get it if they don't want to. Are you as sanguine about the idea that why should we ask courts to say no to something like that?
Yes, I am. I mean, this has been a longstanding view of mine, and it's not just that I worked for the governor, although surely that has pushed me a little bit. And I should say it's not just Democratic governors that are being sued, right? Like, it's also Republican governors now that the issue of lockdowns has been politicized. Governor DeWine, there were articles of impeachment drawn up down in our neighbor to the south. So, this has become a highly politicized issue. I think what I would say is, look, people who are elected representatives can do nasty things. They can do things that really affect people's lives, that hurt people's lives. And if at the end of the day, we place our salvation in the courts and we neglect the people who are actually in charge, or throw up roadblocks in their way because we're like, well, what would happen if we took the courts away? Well, it turns out like you aren't going to be able to do the good things, and the bad things are likely to happen anyhow, right? The courts are not going to save us here. And I think so yes, is there a possibility? I mean, I know for sure there are actions that the Trump administration has taken where I'm pleased as a policy matter to see them struck down in the courts. Do I think it's good in a democracy to shift that much authority to Article 3 judges? God, no. And I really think this entire emergency and the inability of, the United States government as a whole, both the federal and state governments, to coordinate and to actually mount a coherent response should give us a real pause about whether we've created so many roadblocks to action that we're no longer able to accomplish our collective goals. Courts are good at saying no. They're really bad at saying sure.
I'd like to shift the conversation just a little. And to focus on some of the distributional questions that arise in each of your domains, because I think they come up, Nicholson, in the question of who will get the vaccine first and the best version of the vaccine. Kyle, when you talk about different modes of indemnification and which cases will go forward and which will not. And then, of course, Nick, when you talk about which businesses will be able to be open and which will not, right? So in each of these circumstances, there are questions about basically who in our society will carry some of the costs of whatever mode of regulation is out there. Not to mention, of course, the disproportionate burdens that are being carried by underrepresented minorities, by socioeconomically disadvantaged groups who are hardest hit by the pandemic in the first place. So I just am wondering if you could talk a little bit about those questions and how we should think about the equities or the fairness of regulation in each of your domains. So Nicholson, maybe I can start with you, and then we can just sort of work our way around.
Yeah, so on the innovation, obviously the pandemic has hit minority communities hardest. A wildly disproportionate share of infections and deaths have occurred in minority communities. And it's also the case that minority communities are disproportionately likely to bear the economic costs for getting treatment, getting tested, lower rates of insurance. There's a huge disparity here, and it is terrifyingly problematic. We're also seeing some disparity and some distributional concerns with respect to developing cures. So multiple drug companies have noted that they are having a hard time enrolling enough members of minority communities in vaccine trials, which is a horrifyingly ironic consequence of the fact that frequently the research enterprise has proven itself to be not trustworthy with respect to minority communities. And so there is an unsurprising reluctance to participate in those enterprises. Of course, the reason that I say that this is a horrifying irony is because if it turns out that members of minority communities are not involved in the development of new treatments, those treatments potentially might not work as well or might not be as accessible to those communities. Hopefully, of course, they will, but it is not a sure thing. With respect to distribution of already existing things, we've seen really problematic patterns in terms of the distribution of remdesivir, the first treatment that received an emergency use authorization, where at least the first couple of shipments seems to go out in something of a haphazard fashion. They would go to some hospitals and not others. I don't know enough to say whether there were kind of systematic distributional concerns, but there certainly did seem to be how do I put this? Somewhere between a lack of care and a demonstration of incompetence in terms of who actually got the treatments. And that is terrifying when you think about trying to distribute 300 million doses, or 600 million rather, doses of vaccines at a faster clip than we've ever seen before.
Mm-hmm. And is there any way to mitigate those disparities or not really, in your view? I mean, you paint a picture of horror, and so I wonder, are we stuck with the horror? Are there things that might be done realistically to try to make it less horrifying?
I am speechless because the answer is that we need a first injection before any others, and that is a giant injection of competence into government agencies, or not government agencies. Government agencies are full of competence, government leadership, and without that injection, I have a very hard time seeing how we get this done right. Yeah, I wish I had an answer. I don't.
Yeah. How about you, Kyle?
Well, I would first say that tort liability is not going to be the answer when it comes to distributional concerns. Like it's not like first of all, there are not going to be that many tort suits as I've said, but the ones who are successful aren't necessarily going to be disproportionately in the groups that are most harmed by this. I think the way to minimize the sort of disparate impact of COVID, at least one way, would be better health insurance, right? Like it's like stop the efforts to undermine the Affordable Care Act and expand it and strengthen it. And you know, if every state had adopted Medicaid, I mean, my co-panelists know more about this than I do, but if every state had adopted the Medicaid expansion, we'd be in a different position than we are right now with respect to COVID. I guess I would say on the business side, you know, like the effect on businesses of COVID does disproportionately harm African-American community, for example. Like the job losses tend to be hardest there and last the longest. So if we could come up with some, we have some responses, like the federal government has enacted some responses. But you know, ultimately, whether or not there's more insurance coverage for these kinds of business losses could help businesses to bounce back and hire people back. But I'm not optimistic that without some significant intervention at the federal level directly to sort of spend more money, send cash to people who are hurting, that will make a big difference. I mean, maybe in the future, like one of the proposals is, in the future, we should have some kind of new regime that where the federal government acts as a backstop for business interruption claims, sort of like we have for terrorism-related losses, so that everybody can have insurance for this. Like your business is locked down because of a future pandemic, then the federal government will cover 90% of it, and your homeowners your business insurer will cover the other 10%. And businesses don't shut down. People don't lose their jobs. The disparate effect is minimized, but that's way down the road. We don't have that yet, and we probably just need more cash, honestly.
Yeah, and then Nick, how about you? When you think about regulating from, let's say, a governor's office, how do you think about the disparate impact of your regulations on different communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it was a key feature of all of our decision making, and it really ran down a couple of different lines. One is that, Michigan was one of the first states that started publicizing differential rates of sickness and death among minority communities. So, the leadership was sort of keyed into the issue right from the beginning. The other kind of track that it ran along is that, there was a recognition that the folk who have to shut down their businesses are taking it on the chin in an effort to support the rest of us. So I can actually do my job remotely. I'd love to see my students in person, and I can't wait to get back into the classroom. But the fact is, I can do it over Zoom, and most professionals can. But if you run a restaurant, you run a bar, you can't. And that's true, I should say, independent of the lockdown orders, right? I want to be careful about what is, the result of gubernatorial lockdown orders and what is the result of people just staying in their houses because they're scared. And, so you reopen gyms, which the governor did 2 weeks ago. And what? Does everybody start flocking back to gyms? I mean, I know I don't. I work outside at my gym, and I haven't stepped foot inside, and I'm unlikely to for the coming months. Whatever the governor says is legally permissible. And that's going to fall hardest on the people who happen to choose to run gyms in their life. And why are they less deserving than me? That doesn't make any sense to me. So ultimately, the most important thing that the federal government has done so far to help us through this COVID response was its vast expansion of unemployment insurance for people who were out of work. People understate how important this is and how big it was. It was partly because there was a meeting of the minds between Republicans who knew that they were going to be judged on the basis of the economy, and liberals who thought that people are out there hurting and really wanted to shovel money out the door quickly. And so they said, everybody gets a bump of $600 every 2 weeks, and just no questions asked, we're just going to shove money out. And it turns out that when you give people cash, that really does take the edge off. And it was a lot of cash. Now it's dried up at this point, and Congress is not functional enough to have come up with a replacement plan. And that means that we're going to start seeing the economic pain indicators tick right back up. But my hope going forward is, as Kyle says, give them money. It's a low interest rate environment. We can borrow. You save for a rainy day. This is the rainy day. And we should be spending, through the nose so that people who run a gym don't have to lose their livelihoods, even as the rest of us who have steady jobs that we can do from our remote offices, basically do fine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess we have time for just maybe one more question. And I guess I want to just maybe take a step back and ask you all to reflect on the fact that this pandemic is happening in the middle of what we could say during a time in American history when our society is extraordinarily polarized and we seem to have little grace or trust or respect for people on the other side. I mean, it seems that it's very hard really for us as a society even to come together at a time like this, when you would think if anything might bring this country together, it would be something like this, where we should all rally together to try to get past what is a very serious health crisis. And so I guess I just want to hear your all views on the extent to which you think the current political situation in the United States and the divisiveness in the United States has undermined our ability to navigate our way through this crisis, or whether that's sort of the divisiveness is sort of that's sort of external to the facts that look, this pandemic was going to hit us. It's hitting lots of countries, and so it's too bad, but it's ultimately not what is breaking us. So Nicholson, maybe I'll start with you.
I'll
start with you.
Yeah, I can start. So I will say a couple things, and I'll try to end on a high note. I do think it's crippled our response. It's crippled our response because the bunker mentality in the White House has led them to make short-term decisions, to deny, to obstruct, to make it go away as if they could just wish this away. And I think that's been really bad. I think the place where, if I had to say from a public health perspective, their intervention has been the most damaging has been around masks. I think we have a very different world if we had a president who accepted the science on masks and was willing to demonstrate and lead by example on masks. As it is, there is a small minority of people who still believe that it is a conspiracy. I don't know to what end, but that it's a conspiracy and that they shouldn't be forced to wear them, and that their precious civil liberties have been taken against them because they have to wear a piece of gauze over their mouth. So I think it has hurt us a lot. And the fact that we don't have another bailout or COVID support law passed, I think is a function of that. But I will try to say this, I was surprised at how long it took to politicize this issue. Here in the state of Michigan, we were able to get, wide public buy-in for measures that just 6 months ago would have been completely inconceivable to any of us. The notion that a governor would unilaterally shut down an economy. And it wasn't just us, it was states all across the nation. We did it collectively, we did it together, and together we really did drive down our case numbers and did it on fairly short order. Was it perfect? No. Did people scream along the way? Sure. But I think by focusing on the latest rage that you see in the news, you forget that at least for a while, there was a lot of goodwill. And that actually that goodwill mattered and translated into policy outcomes that saved lives. Do I wish it could be better than it was? Yeah, of course. But, relative to a baseline where we be at each other's throats right away, I don't know, maybe we did okay.
Seems like a positive note to end on, but Kyle and Nicholson, I'll let you put a damper on it if you'd like.
Maybe I'll just say I agree with Nick.
Okay, well, great. Well, so I think it's basically time to wrap up. I want to thank all three of you for doing this. So I will clap on behalf of the audience. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for tuning in and sharing your evening with us. And just remind you that on October 13th, we have our next installation in the series with Sam Baggins and Ellen Katz talking about voting rights in America. So that is timed on purpose to be just a few weeks before the election to get a sense of what's happening in that domain. Thanks to all of you, and see you soon.